Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Listeners, the time has come for yet another Sandie Docker book to land on bookshelves across Australia. I can almost hear a collective sigh from book lovers everywhere, desperate to get their hands on Sandie's latest release, the Lyrebird Lake Ladies Choir, published by Penguin Random House Australia. Sandie's sixth novel, The Lyrebird Lake Ladies Choir, is a moving and empowering story about three women set between 1973 and the present day. It explores deeply emotional and confronting issues in a heartfelt, sensitive and hopeful way in true Sandie Docker style. I'm always mindful that there may be listeners tuning in today who are new to the podcast or indeed new to Sandie's books, so perhaps some extra background is in order. Sandie's debut novel, The Kookaburra Creek Cafe, was published back in 2018, closely followed by The Cottage at Rosella Cove, the Banksia Bay Beach Shack, the Wattle Island Book Club, and then the Red Gum River Retreat last year. Spotlighting the joys and challenges of living in small communities as well as little known or overlooked historical events, Sandie's novels weave past and present timelines to create charming, compelling stories that leave their emotional imprint long after you finished reading, making her one of Australia's best-selling and much-loved authors, someone I'm lucky enough to call friend. And on that note, I'm delighted to welcome Sandie back to the podcast today to chat about the Lyrebird Lake Ladies Choir. Hi, Sandie.
Hi, Claudine. I think I'm the lucky one to have you as a friend. It's always a pleasure chatting with you.
And indeed, such a pleasure for me to chat with you. And my goodness, I was thinking about this earlier today. Novel number 6, no mean feat, my friend. Congratulations.
Thank you. Who'd have thunk it, hey?
Me, for sure.
Sitting in my English classroom in Coffs Harbour all those years ago. Yeah, it's quite surreal, and I do have to pinch myself sometimes.
I'm just looking at your beautiful display behind you. 6 gorgeous books, beautiful covers. Your branding has been just incredible. You must feel so proud just looking at the 6 of them sitting there.
I can't take any credit for the covers. That is the artist from Penguin who does that for me, and she does a fabulous job. But yeah, I know we're not, particularly as women, supposed to say that we're proud of our achievements, but I am actually very proud of the 6 novels, what's inside those covers. 6 novels in 6 years, and I love them, and I hope that readers love them too. And it is a bit of an achievement. So yeah.
Not a bit. It is an incredible achievement. If you don't want to say it, I'm going to say it. Kookaburra Creek Cafe was published back in 2018, which was the year that we first met. Did you think then that you wanted to make a full-time career out of writing, or was that just something that kind of unfolded for you?
I knew that was what I wanted. I didn't know if it was going to be possible. So I started with Kookaburra and then Rosella Cove on a 2-book deal. So I knew I had the 2 of them. What was going to come after that is an unknown. It still is an unknown. What comes after number 6, we don't know. So it was definitely something I wanted, but whether it was achievable or not, I didn't know at the time. And you just take it as it comes.
Now, you said it before, but 6 novels in 6 years. I wondered, do you ever see a time when you won't want to be writing?
Usually after I hand in the final edits of any book is when I have that moment of, I can't do that again. Partly because I'm really useless with deadlines, and so I'm often pulling all-nighters at those points in time. So that's on me. And I do need a little bit of a break once I've handed in those final edits, from a book, and just switch that brain completely off from writing. And then it can take me a little while to get back into that mindset. But in terms of long term, no, there will never be a time where I don't want to be writing.
The thing about your book, Sandie, and which I alluded to in my introduction, is that they have a way of packing an emotional punch. You throw your characters into the worst possible situations and watch them try and fight their way out, remarkably still clinging onto hope. And the Lyrebird Lake Ladies Choir is no exception. So I wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about the story and what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, I do like to put my characters and hopefully my readers through a bit of an emotional ringer. And you are very right that I hope that hope comes through each one of those novels, because at the end of the day, without hope, what have we got? And it doesn't matter how bad your life is. If you've got that hope that you can cling to, then that's what gets you through. So I do try to do that. In terms of the Lyrebird Lake Ladies Choir, we have Eleanor and Maggie, who are two sisters growing up in Ireland, and they are forced to come to Australia in the 1970s. And they make a life here for themselves. And in their 60s, they're running a choir and a lodge for women who find themselves a little bit lost and lonely and need a helping hand. And one woman who turns up at the lodge and at the choir is Hannah. And she's a single mum who's been forced into homelessness. And she joins the choir. And when she joins the choir, Eleanor, the older sister, discovers that Hannah is aware of a song, a lullaby that Eleanor wrote 40 years ago. And it was a song that Eleanor hadn't shown anyone ever before. And so Eleanor tries to figure out who Hannah is, why she's there, and what does she want.
There's a lot to unpack in what you've just said, but I wondered if perhaps we could start with music.
Mm-hmm.
Music as therapy was a theme that you explored in your last novel, The Red Gum River Retreat, and music finds its way into this novel in the form of the Lyrebird Lake Ladies Choir. So I wondered if you could tell me about Maggie and Eleanor's decision to start a choir, and what did it mean for them and their individual or collective journeys in this novel?
Yeah, so sisters Eleanor and Maggie grew up singing in their church choir back in Ireland. So it's always been a part of their life. And they're both quite talented singers, Maggie, the younger sister in particular. And Eleanor has dreams as a youngster of writing songs for a living, which of course goes against her parents' wishes and dreams for the two of them. But when they come to Australia and, once they've hit that retirement age, they decide to start the choir as a way to connect to their community and also as a way to connect with each other, because there's a bit of a secret that's separated the two of them over the years, and it's a way that they can maybe connect to each other. Maggie says something along the lines of she wants her sister back, and she's hoping that the choir can bring her sister back. And they started as a community choir, so you don't need to audition, you don't need to be able to sing a note in tune, because for them, it's about bringing women together and finding strength in that togetherness. And there's a really interesting, I hope, eclectic cast of choir members that sort of fill out those roles.
Talking about the choir and thinking about the cast of characters who join the choir leads me to ask you about one of the major themes that you explore in this novel, which is homelessness. And as you mentioned earlier, Hannah is homeless. That's when we meet her. Older women in Australia are one of the fastest growing demographic of homeless people. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and what it would mean for somebody like that to be joining a choir, perhaps.
Yeah, and not just older women, women in general are actually the fastest growing demographic. There are around 122,000 homeless people each night in Australia. And in March 2023, there was a study conducted, and 3 out of 4 of those people were women and children. And women in their 40s and 50s are making up the bulk of those people newly finding themselves homeless. And I tried to put myself in that situation, how could that happen? And it's actually a lot easier than you think it is for it to happen. And then what would that look like for Hannah? And, we can talk about that a little bit later perhaps, but she makes a decision when she's living in her car with her young son to just get out of Sydney. It's just too hard and it's too expensive and she's got no options, and she heads to Lyrebird Lake. And when she's there, she joins this choir. And it's through that choir that she starts to feel that maybe she does have some hope to dig herself out of this situation, and that sense of belonging again, and a lot of the women in the choir have some sort of story in their background that leads them there. We've got a cancer survivor who finds herself broke. We've got a woman who joins after her marriage implodes. We've got a woman who's had an accident in her 30s and is now wheelchair bound, and she finds community with those women. We've got a young girl who gets kicked out of home because of her sexuality. And so you've got these amazing women who are so disparate in their experiences and their backgrounds, but they come together in this choir, and it's that one place where they can feel safe and they can feel that they belong and they know they've got the support of those other women. And so for Hannah, it's a really important time in her life to get herself back on her feet.
Support was something that really struck me as, what these women needed at this point in their life. And so if we can just focus on Hannah for a moment longer, she, as you said, became homeless as a result of her husband dying, and after years of trying to pursue a singing career. But she was well educated and not without skills. And so, you talked a little bit about how easy it is for women to find themselves in this situation. So how does a woman like Hannah end up in this situation?
Yeah, and this is where I tried to think about my own situation. I'm well educated, I have a university degree, I'm in a very stable relationship with a stable roof over my head. Thankfully, by the grace of the universe, I, am financially stable. But if something ever happened to my husband or between us, I would be in big trouble because I've been a stay-at-home mum for so many years. Same with Hannah. She's raising her son, Leo. I'm in a career now that comes under the banner of, creativity. And as anyone who knows anything about creative careers, there's not a lot of security in a creative career, and your income is sporadic and not always that high. And so I would be in that situation. We have a massive mortgage over our heads, and if something happened to my husband's income, we're gone. And so it is actually a lot easier than we think. And because she's been at home, because she's been chasing this creative career, finding another job with more stable hours, with a young son to look after, stable income, and enough in Sydney to pay a rent, it's a really hard thing for her to do, because while she is well educated and she's got certain skills, she doesn't have those skills that she needs to secure a really good job.
And I think one of the sadder parts of this story for me was witnessing Hannah's struggle with this, her day-to-day struggle as a mother with a young child, and the hopelessness of the situation that she is facing, especially while she was living in Sydney.
Yeah, and again, what would I do in that situation? I am lucky that my daughter is now an adult, and so I wouldn't be in quite that same situation if it were to happen to me. But how do you keep, an 8-year-old boy happy and healthy when you're living in your car? How do you keep his spirits up when your spirits are so down? How do you find a job that fits in with him and what he needs when you haven't got a lot of support around you either? It was really important for me to delve deep into what that would be like for a mum.
To that end, Sandie, what kind of research did you do to try and bring Hannah's experiences to the page?
Yeah, I spoke to my local Mission Australia office, which is not too far away from where I live, and asked them, at the very beginning, what sort of circumstances can we imagine this would be? What would it look like? And then what does she do? How does she get help? Is there help for her? And it's that sort of research that was really important for me to find. And there's a moment at the very beginning of the book, this won't be a spoiler for anyone, where Hannah's trying to access some accommodation through these emergency services that are available. And it's not working out too great for her. The first one she goes to is only for DV victims, and she's not one, so she can't take those places. The next one she goes to won't take children. She's got an 8-year-old. It's a real hassle to find a place for her. And she ends up at a hotel, which is used for emergency accommodation, and you can only stay for 2 nights at a time. And that actually came out of that research that I did with speaking with Mission Australia. And they said, this is what would happen. You'd have 2 nights. It does cost you money. You have to leave, come back and apply again. And the comment that stuck with me was that they said, but I wouldn't want to stay there.
Wow.
And that was like, okay. And then they sort of described an example of one in my local area. And I'm like, yeah, no. If I was a mum with an 8-year-old kid, I wouldn't want to be staying there either.
Yeah. And I think that you have conveyed the lack of choices that Hannah has so clearly, particularly in these scenes that I'm thinking of, where she does take up this emergency accommodation. Quite frightening, really. And then also just her daily battle of, parking her car in a place that she is not going to be singled out as somebody who is living in her car, that constant stress and pressure of finding a new spot and finding a spot that is safe.
Safe.
Yeah, really, you've done such an incredible job to bring Hannah's experiences to the page.
She doesn't want Leo taken away from her. If Child Services discover that she's living in the car with her son, what's going to happen to her son? So there's layers upon layers of this stress for her that she's living with on a daily basis.
Talking about stress, and I think that you mentioned it a little bit earlier, Hannah doesn't have a lot of choices, and she especially doesn't have a lot of support around her, which leads me to Hannah's relationship with her mother, Kathleen. I think it's fair to say that that was a difficult relationship, which meant that Hannah was unable to be truthful about the situation that she found herself in with Kathleen. And in fact, I would go so far as to suggest that Kathleen was downright cruel to her only child and exceptionally judgmental. I wondered if you could talk more about this relationship and the impact that it had on Hannah's journey.
Yeah, prickly is probably the nicest way to describe Hannah's mum, Kathleen. You're all right. She's very, very judgmental, and she's got certain expectations that Hannah hasn't met in her life, and the decisions that Hannah's made that she hasn't agreed with. And she's not somebody that Hannah can turn to and say, Mum, I'm in trouble. I need some help. She almost does at one point, and then Mum makes yet another comment that makes her retreat. It's really hard for her not to have that person in her life, and I've always been of the opinion, and other people may argue with this, that your mum is supposed to be the one person that you can count on in life. And Hannah doesn't have that with her mum. So she's not only balancing her own situation, but she's balancing this relationship with her mum. How much does she tell her? And part of it is that there's this gulf between them, and there always has been. Hannah makes reference to it, even as a child, she was not close to her mum. There is a reason that there is a gulf between them, which we won't go into. And towards the end of the novel, we do find out that Kathleen's also carrying some issues from the past that Hannah knows nothing about, which may or may not be contributing to this, really stressful relationship that they have.
Like many of your novels, Sandie, trauma is a feature of this story. We have the trauma of Hannah losing her beloved Noah, and Leo's ongoing trauma following the loss of his father and his changing circumstances. But then there's also trauma suffered by sisters Eleanor and Maggie too. We talked a little bit about this before we started recording, and it is a little bit difficult to talk about a significant part of this story. But I wondered if you could set the scene for the world that Eleanor and Maggie come from, and how the attitudes of the time forced them from their home and saw them settle in Lyrebird Lake in the 1970s.
Yeah, so in the 1970s, Eleanor and Maggie are 19 and 16 years old, and they're living in a small village in Ireland in a community that is very focused on their beliefs and their religion, and mum and dad are very high up in society there. And we're talking, as I said, 1970s Ireland, hierarchy was important in this small village, and mum and dad are quite high up in there. And so there are huge expectations on Eleanor and Maggie and how they should behave and what they should be expecting out of life. Mum and dad are, particularly mum, dogmatic about their beliefs. And Eleanor and Maggie are both a little bit free-spirited, Maggie probably more so than Ellie. And they find themselves in a situation where Maggie ends up carrying a child. And this obviously at 16 in 1970s Ireland is a big no-no. And it's the fallout from that that sees them come to Australia, just the two of them on their own. And Eleanor is essentially taking responsibility for Maggie's life.
So, unmarried, pregnant woman.
Yep.
Definitely a no-no in 1970s Ireland, but
Yep.
also a bit of a no-no here in Australia at the time. And this issue kind of leads me to ask about another issue which you explore in some detail in the book, which is forced adoption. It was a terrible policy that resulted in many an unmarried woman being separated from their babies in traumatic and illegal practices. Let's be frank about it. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and why you wanted to explore it in the context of this novel?
Yeah, so obviously one of the options that, well, it's not really an option, it's a directive that Maggie's parents give her when they find out she's pregnant, is that they will send her away to one of those homes at the far end of the country where nobody knows them. She'll have the baby and the baby will be adopted out. But Maggie is determined that she wants to keep the baby. It was a baby that she feels was created out of love, and she wants to keep it. So that was the only option that mum was giving Maggie at the time. And that's why they end up in Australia, because she wants to keep it. And that was the only way they could figure out how to keep it. And it was really interesting when I was doing the research into this, I guess because I'm a child of the 70s, I think of these sorts of things happening way back when, or that sort of thing would have happened in the 1920s, or that sort of thing would have happened in the 1930s. And when I was looking into this, while I understood it about Ireland being such a religious country, I thought surely in Australia it wouldn't have happened. Surely not in the 1970s. We're talking yours and my lifetime, Claudine. When I did the research, I was shocked to find that it was happening here in Australia as well. It was an incredibly wide practice in the 1970s and went as late into the mid 80s. And that blew my mind. How? How in my lifetime could that be happening here in Australia when we think of ourselves as this lucky, free, happy country? And this was happening. That could have been me. That could have been you if our parents had slightly different circumstances. So that was a huge eye opener for me. And then doing the research into how, I don't think there's any other word for it but evil, the practices were around that the girls had no choice, that they were coerced and lied to and tricked. And it was just phenomenal what was being done in the 1970s, not only in Ireland, but also here in Australia.
And I would say that this is an issue that has and continues to have ongoing impacts on the lives of those affected by the practices. And the legacy of that trauma is one of the reasons Eleanor and Maggie come back to Lyrebird Lake and buy the old house, what they call the lodge, isn't it?
Yeah, so when they came to Australia, they went to live with their Aunt Bernadette, who's living on the lake next to this grand house owned by a rich family. And in their later years, Eleanor and Maggie decide to buy that grand old house because they have some fabulous memories of their time on the lake while Maggie is pregnant. And they want to head back there and, I guess, in a way, heal some of the wounds that have happened in their past. It was a bit of serendipity, I guess, that the lodge became available to them at that point in their life. And yeah, they're trying to, I guess, make up for the past.
It occurred to me, Sandie, while reading this book, that it does in part explore, and you referred to it earlier, the uncertainty of a career in the arts or a creative career, both for Eleanor as a song composer or a songwriter and Hannah as a singer. You know, Eleanor certainly never wanted anyone to know that she was entering a songwriting contest. And for Hannah, there was this constant disapproval from her mother for following a career in music instead of another career. Can you talk a little bit more about this and why this was something you wanted to talk about in the novel?
Well, I guess it's slightly autobiographical in a way, I guess. You know, working in a creative space and knowing how precarious that is, and, you know, that the incomes are a lot less than people think that they are, and certainly a lot less stable than people think they are. And, you know, to a degree, some people might have this glamorized version of working in the arts, whether it's writing or music or painting or whatever it might be. But the reality is quite the opposite of anything glamorous. I may well be drawing on some personal comments that have been flung my way from certain members of my family about, you know, real jobs and your husband supporting you and those sorts of things. And we do this because we're passionate about it. And you know that just as much as I do, Claudine. Writing is a labour of love, but it's something that you have to do. It's inside you, but the rewards aren't always there for it. Again, it ties into the story. When I was creating Hannah and Leo and looking at them being homeless, I had to come up with a plausible reason as to why. Why is she in this situation? And that was when I started thinking about me and my situation. You know, it would be plausible if you're in this kind of a job, that uncertainty is there. And it's tough, you know. And, you know, Eleanor particularly, you know, that was in the 1970s. She was thinking that she would be this songwriter, which of course mum and dad did not approve of at all. That is not a respectable job for a well-to-do young lady. And then when Maggie falls pregnant, she looks after Maggie and she kind of gives up on that dream, and she has to take responsibility for Maggie here in Australia. Who's going to provide for Maggie and the baby? Eleanor has to get a proper job.
Lyrebird Lake, like many of the other settings of your novels, is a fictional town.
Yes.
Brought to life so beautifully within the pages of this novel. But I wondered if you could give us some clue of the places you had in mind when you were writing.
Claudine, I believe that you already know the answer to this, that I can't answer this question. And I tell this story when I'm out and about because people often ask me, you know, where is Red Gum River? Where is Lyrebird Lake? And I made the fatal error almost back when Kookaburra came out, and you were there that day. That was the day that we met at an event where somebody asked me where Kookaburra Creek was, and I answered in my head approximately where I thought it was. And a woman stood with her hands on her hips and said, no, it's not. It's somewhere else. And so since then, I've never ever answered the question in public of where these inspirations come from. However, with Lyrebird, as with all of them, they're sort of an accumulation, an amalgamation of places that I have experienced growing up, outside of Sydney. I did not grow up here. And places that I have visited, and a slightly idealized version of those small towns. The lake came about because I have a bit of a water theme going through my books, and I needed another body of water. That was a body of water that I could use. And I was having a holiday at Lake Macquarie in the process of writing this, and just the peace that I found writing by the lake sort of bled into this, I think. So that was where the lake aspect came from. However, Lyrebird Lake is not Lake Macquarie.
Well answered indeed. Now, you mentioned the wonderful cast of characters that you have amassed for this book, the members of the choir. But one of my favorite characters in this book is Benjamin Sharma, a divorce lawyer who sets up a practice in Lyrebird Lake and someone who becomes rather important to Hannah and Leo's journey in this novel. I wondered if you could tell us more about him and whether he was inspired by any real life character.
Oh, like lawyers I might know, Claudine.
Yeah. Well, yes, perhaps.
Again, as with my places, there's never any one inspiration, or stepping off point. It's usually an amalgamation of things. And I needed that counterpoint, I guess, to Hannah, whose life and whose career choices are very unstable, with somebody who has a lot of stability. Being a lawyer is a relatively stable profession, and he is a very successful lawyer. He was part of a practice in Sydney, a very successful practice, and he left that post-divorce and sets up this practice in Lyrebird Lake. So he's finding his way on a personal level, but professionally he's got it all together. And so I needed that counterpoint. And I wanted to have something probably a little bit different to the stereotype of a lawyer that we often see, that they're smarmy and they're liars and they're out for themselves. He's a very kind and gentle man with a really, really good heart. And I wanted to have an example of for want of a better word, particularly in this day and age, a good man. I don't think we see enough of those sorts of men in our literature, that this is the kind of man that I would be happy to marry, who is kind and gentle and loyal and sweet. He's not perfect, but that's what I wanted to create in him.
Yeah, he was a really community-minded man as well, something that I really enjoyed reading about in him. But I will say that, having had the benefit of reading all your books to date, I don't think there is one of your books that doesn't have a good man in it.
I hope so. And again, for that very reason, I think we need to see examples of that, particularly for any young women coming through, or even ourselves. This is the kind of man we should want to be with. And that doesn't mean they're perfect. None of them are perfect. They've all got issues or baggage or whatever the case may be. That doesn't mean you can't be good. These toxic men and these alpha males that are, six-packed and chiseled jaws and perfect physically, that's not real. Well, not in my life anyway. It's not real. I don't know too many men that look like that and behave like that, thankfully. So it's important for me to have those men in the story. And it was really interesting during the editing process. And I don't think my editor will be upset with me sharing this. We have a really good and open working relationship. But she kept telling me he was too nice in the original drafts, and I had to give him a little bit of edge. And I kept pushing back, and it's like, but it's okay to have a nice man. It really is okay. I did get to a point where I could see it. He was maybe a little bit saccharine in the first couple of drafts, so I took that away from him, but I did not take away his niceness, because I think that's really important.
Now, his coffee addiction might be, a bit pathological. So, there's a major flaw there.
There is, and I don't drink coffee at all, so I don't know where that came from. My husband does. My husband grinds his own beans. Maybe that's where it came from. But interestingly, you bring that up, because that's one of the things that she made me cut. So the amount of coffee in this final version is about half, maybe a quarter of what was originally in the draft. So I'm very glad I did listen to her and cut that out. Otherwise, I don't know what you'd be saying to me right now.
As a fellow caffeine addict, I totally sympathize with him. Now, I didn't miss the reference to Hugh Jackman in this novel. For listeners out there, this is a trusted feature of every Sandie Docker book so far. Sandie, can you fill listeners in on this? And have you managed to capture Hugh Jackman's attention yet?
Not yet, Claudine. This is a work in progress. I think quite by accident he found his way into the Kookaburra Creek Cafe, and there are only ever references to him in some form or another. I decided then that I was going to mention him in every single one of my novels so that one day somebody who's reading these novels will figure that out and let him know that there is an Australian author that has mentioned him in every single one of her novels, and then he will want to meet that author because it's not stalkerish at all. That's when our true love story will begin. So I'm still waiting for that moment, although there is now an opportunity that is open that wasn't there before. So who knows, maybe number 6 is the charm and somebody will let him know.
This has got to be the longest love letter ever.
Look, you've got to play the long game when it comes to romance, Claudine, because they're the ones that last.
Sandie, I was talking to someone the other day who told me that her recently published book was her legacy. That if she didn't publish anything else, that her art through her novel was an enduring legacy through which her children and grandchildren would know who she was and what she stood for. As your legacy, what do you think your books say about you and what's important to you?
Oh gosh, I hope a psychologist doesn't read them with that with that vision to discover what it says about me. As readers will know, I do like to do certain things towards the end of my novels with at least one character every novel, which may indicate a slight mental health issue for me, perhaps. But no, I don't think about legacy when I'm writing. It's not something I am conscious of. But now that you have mentioned it, I guess more so for my daughter. You know, she's just turned 18. She's an adult now. She has not read any of my novels. That's just not on her radar, which is a perfectly normal response, I think, from a teenager. But, you know, one day, if and when I'm not here, if she ever does pick up these books and reads them, she will see a lot of me in them, because I think as writers, and again, you would know this, Claudine, we can't help but infuse parts of ourselves into either the characters or the plots or the emotions or all of the above. And so if Emily were to read these later and go, I understand my mum a little bit more now, then maybe that's the legacy that I leave behind.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. Sandie, Northern Beaches Readers Festival 2024 is fast approaching, and as many listeners will already know, both you and I are on the organising committee for that festival. You are the director. I wondered if you wanted to say anything more about this, and if listeners wanted to find out more information where they could learn about what's happening this year.
You and I and a wonderful committee of women, mostly writers, set up the Northern Beaches Readers Festival a few years ago, and after a few hiccups with that C word that nobody ever talks about these days, we got it off the ground in 2022. And it's a festival that focuses on fiction, Australian fiction, and from those genres that you like to curl up in bed with at nighttime. So crime, romance, historical, women's fiction, that sort of thing. And it was a huge success in 2022. And we're off again this year, 27th to the 29th of September, up at the gorgeous seaside village of Avalon. We have an amazing group of authors lined up, which you can find on our website, which is www.nbrf.com.au. And we're really looking forward to releasing the program in July. Again, it's that sense of community, which, as you mentioned earlier, comes through my books, and it's something that I believe very strongly in, and that writing community that is incredibly supportive, as you know, Claudine, and that connection that writers have with their readers. And that's the basis of the festival, you know, connecting readers and authors together. And that's what we hope to achieve again this year.
Yeah, fantastic. I, for one, am very much looking forward to the lineup this year. I think we've managed to curate an incredible collection of authors across a variety of genres. there is going to be something there for everybody this festival.
Yeah, if you read, then you will find more than one author there that you will want to go and see.
Before we finish up, I wondered if there was one thing you'd like readers to take away from the Lyrebird Lake Ladies Choir, what would that be?
I guess it comes back to that word that you used at the top of this talk, Claudine, and that is hope. As readers, we bring our own experiences to what we read, which is why it's such an individual and unique experience. What you get out of reading a particular book will be different to what I get out of it. So what they get out of it will depend on their own situation and their own history and their own emotions. But at the end of the day, if they bring hope with them, that means I've done my job, I guess.
Sandie, I absolutely loved reading the Lyrebird Lake Ladies Choir, and I cannot wait for readers to find out for themselves how very special this story is. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you, Claudine. It is always a pleasure speaking with you.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.